Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison. I want to welcome you to this session of Humanity Rising as we convene our second of 5 programs on human flourishing in our time. Today, we're going to be looking at the science of flourishing. And before we do that, I want to continue my comments as we all bear witness to what is taking place in Gaza, as roughly 1.5 million Palestinians out of a total Gazan population of 2.3 million are huddled, homeless, hungry, without sanitation, very little food or water in the southernmost part of Gaza as it butts up against the Egyptian border, all concentrated in a small town of Rafah, normally about 200,000 people. And today, as we speak, over 1.5 million people, mostly women and children. Over the last 24 hours, the Israelis have continued their random bombing and sniping, killing another 100, mostly women and children. Yesterday, I talked about the destruction of the Al-Isra University, the last of 12 Gazan universities that was seeded with over 300 mines and blown to smithereens. I just want to start today by just taking that in again. You know, the Gazans, the Palestinians in Gaza are among the poorest people in the world, made so because of 80 years of occupation by the Israelis, where they've been stripped of dignity, kept on starvation diets, as the Israelis have calculated that a human being needs 1,200 calories a day. So they've allowed just enough food into Gaza for 1,400 calories a day. And they've been doing that since 2007. In the midst of all that dehumanization, the Palestinians in Gaza are among the most literate people in the world. They love learning. They love the poetry, the spirituality of their people. And over the last several months, not only has Israel destroyed every single university and almost all the schools, they systematically assassinated nearly 100 professors and thousands of students, looting the museums, desecrating the graveyards, destroying virtually every semblance of civilization in Gaza. And now they've got them all huddled down on the southern border. And Netanyahu says, we're going in to destroy everything. And what we're experiencing right now is an equipoise as not only more and more Jews are speaking out against this genocide, but more and more leaders, the head of the foreign ministry of the EU yesterday spoke out. Others are speaking out. So we're right in that moment where the Israelis are hesitating to go in and finish them off. I mentioned yesterday the responsibility of the Jewish people to take action. I received a number of communications about that. And many people said, well, you can talk about the Israelis, but don't talk about the Jews. Talk about humanity. And I want to address that just for a moment, because I think it's a seminal point. It's certainly true that iniquity lies in the heart of every human being. It's also true that we're all individually responsible for our actions and collectively responsible for our actions. There was anti-Semitism for centuries in Europe, but it was the German people that produced the Nazis. The German people were culpable for what their government did. It's important to remember about Israel that this is not a secular state, free democratic state. It is an explicitly Jewish state. That was passed into law by the Netanyahu government after many years of opposition in 2017. And in 2022, the Netanyahu government passed legislation that said that not only are Jews unique in Israel by God-given right, they're unique over all of greater Israel, meaning Palestine. The Jewish flag is in Gaza. The Israeli government states repeatedly that it is acting on behalf of the Jewish people. And so my appeal yesterday for Jews around the world, as Jews, to stand up and say, no, you are not acting on our behalf, is, in my view, the quickest way we can get Netanyahu to stand down. The United States isn't going to do it. The EU may engage in rhetoric, but they're not going to do anything. I think it's up to the Jewish people to send elders to Jerusalem and demand that Netanyahu stand down in the same way that senior Republicans in the US Senate went to the White House in August of 1974 and demanded that Richard Nixon resign. Netanyahu is a psychopath. He is not doing this on behalf of the Jewish people. And today I watched a video of Gabor Mate, who, if I was going to select a group of people to go to Jerusalem, Gabor Mate would be one of them. He's a Hungarian Jew, born in World War II. And his mother actually, when he was only 6 weeks old, gave him away to a non-Jewish woman she met on the streets because the Nazis were all over and she thought she was going to be killed. He was a victim of anti-Semitism. He was a Zionist, ardent Zionist in his youth. And then he began to realize what Israel was doing to Palestine. That Israel was doing to the Palestinians what the Germans did to the Jews. And he realized that he had to speak out. And he just released a YouTube, which I'll put in the chat, with his two sons agonizing as Jews over what's happening and speaking about the paralysis in the Jewish community. And Gabor Mate ended, he says, what we're witnessing is one of the greatest disasters in all of Jewish history. And we have to figure out a way for our people to redeem themselves from what's happening in their name. So just like the Germans in the 30s were responsible for what the Nazis did, the Jewish people, particularly in Israel, are responsible and have to take action. Just like as a young man, I grew up in the Vietnam War as an American. As an American, I needed to refuse the draft. That's what democracies are. They're of the people, for the people, by the people. And when our governments are going off the cliff, in this case, into committing genocide, we need to speak out. That's why I've been speaking out. That not only is the House of Israel culpable for this, so is the House of America. The United States is the willing executioner of Benjamin Netanyahu. And the President of the United States is guilty of genocide because the weapons, the bombs, the bullets, the airplanes all say made in USA. And so as an American, 10th generation American, whose people first came to these shores in 1686, fleeing the persecutions of Louis XIV in France, morally, I have to speak out. As Abraham Heschel said, sometimes you have to pray with your feet, as he marched with Martin Luther King in the 1950s and the 1960s against the criticism of fellow rabbis who said that it was not kosher to protest on the Sabbath. We're witnessing one of the great crimes of history. It's a trans-historical event. As I've said many times, and I say again, it's like being alive 2,000 years ago in Jerusalem during the time of Jesus. We need to pay attention to the magnitude of what's taking place. And because of the magnitude of what's taking place, we have to take a stand. We have to be counted. Just like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and others in the 1930s in Germany. One of the deepest truths in human history is that evil prevails when the good people do nothing. So thank you, everyone, for bearing witness with me as we begin our sessions on Humanity Rising. 1,000 Reformed Jewish leaders signed a petition for an immediate ceasefire that was released yesterday. Jews for Peace continues to be relentlessly active, certainly here in Washington, D.C., comprised mostly of young Jewish activists. It's time. All of us took our stand against genocide. We talk about these matters against the backdrop this week of human flourishing. It's hard to know how one flourishes in a time such as ours. To flourish, to be happy, to have meaningful lives tends to connote a time of normalcy when you have the space physically and spiritually to live a life of fulfillment and joy and love. But we are in a hyper-complex world where stress, not equanimity, presides, where misinformation is hiding the truth. So one wonders as we contemplate these issues and these words like flourishing, what do they mean when life is being lived in the crucible of division, fake news, and antagonism of body and spirit? My pleasure now to introduce my very good friend and colleague, Tom Eddington, who's the co-convener with Carson Kelly of our Week on Flourishing. Tom, I know I'm speaking strongly on Gaza. Don't feel in any way obligated to comment. You can launch right into the program. But I just share these things because I want all of us to hold the crucible of our time. Thank you, Tom.
Yeah, thank you, Jim. And I genuinely appreciate the complexities of what it means to be human. We've got roughly 8 billion people on the planet, most of whom, well over 7 billion, are living in a state of thriving, in a state of flourishing. And it doesn't negate some of the things that are going on. It doesn't negate the starvation. It doesn't negate so many of the things in terms of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, that people are at the bottom of the pyramid of Maslow's hierarchy. And yet the vast majority of human beings are in a state of flourishing and some relative state of flourishing. And it makes it very confusing. It makes it very hard. And so I really appreciate collaborating with Carson this week on helping us better understand flourishing and how do we live from that place. So welcome, Carson. Sorry I missed you yesterday, and really looking forward to being in the conversation today, and grateful for the incredible panel you brought together.
Thanks, Tom. And you were missed yesterday, so I'm glad to see you here. And I know your schedule has a lot of demands on it, but I'm grateful that you're here. And two, I'd like to speak. Jim, thank you for in terms of your words around Gaza and educating us on some of the facts that are happening there. I want to also thank you again for the invitation to be a part of Humanity Rising's podcasting efforts and the opportunity to bring forward some really, truly brilliant colleagues in the work that they're doing in the world. As Jim said, or I'm sorry, as Tom said, I'm Carson Kelly. I'm the founder of Compassion 2.0. Compassion 2.0, for those of you who aren't familiar, is a collection of professionals who are trying to scale compassion through the intentional architecture of compassionate human experience that can be measured and validated. We do this through the creation of compassionate and flourishing frameworks through both product development and organizational culture. And our community consists of all kinds of folks: organizational developers and HR leadership, product developers and designers, neuroscientists, behavior scientists, medical doctors, UX, UI designers, venture capitalists, entrepreneurs, and more. So as Tom and Jim have said, we're looking this week at modern flourishing from the perspective of the global north. And we recognize that our modern cultures and organizations and society, and typically thought of as the Western frame, have great challenges. And we see this reflected in our our mental and emotional well-being and our indicators, our societal relationships, environmental, state, et cetera. We have a lot to learn from all kinds of people all over the planet. So again, this is our survey this week, and we'll be touching on various perspectives. So yesterday we talked about some of how money and the translation of money into manifestation of organizational effort, be it for-profit or nonprofit, how that relationship can really be redefined into a flourishing frame. Today we're going to be talking about from a scientific perspective from our friends who are neuroscientists and medical doctors. And then for the remainder of the week, we'll be talking about group practices and then also ancient wisdom in modern frames. And we hope that really ultimately this week, the listener will come away with a sense of different topics that they might want to explore for themselves to be able to further their own flourishing, particularly in this great time of challenge that we're facing societally, globally, politically, et cetera. Also, I want to be clear, too, that the views expressed by the individuals are their own, and the appearance on the program with us doesn't imply an endorsement of them or really any entity that they represent. I've asked our guests to join our conversation today in a professional manner to discuss their professional work, and in that capacity, they've agreed to come online and to share their work, and to, like I said, to do so, they're not necessarily reflecting my views or Tom or Jim's views or anybody else's views, but just here to talk about their work. So with that, I'd like to turn our attention. Today, we're joined in part by two neuroscientists from the Independent Neuroscience Research Lab, the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies. We have Nico Regente, who's the principal investigator for the IACS, and he was with us in October last year when we had our first week on Compassion 2.0 and joins us again today. And also with him is colleague Dr. Felix Schoeller, who's a senior researcher as well at the IACS. So if you guys want to jump on, that'd be great. And then in addition, we also have two of our medical doctors. So we have neuroscience Dr. Flavor and medical Dr. Flavor coming with us from Seity Health. We have Sam Romeo and Dr. Chris Hawley, who are also the co-founders of Seity Health. So they'll be joining us today for conversation about both of these groups are just doing super cool stuff. So what I'd like to do now, if we can, is to turn our attention first to Nico. And Nico, if you could tell us a little bit about the IACS and its mission and scope of investigation, and how did you come to do this work? And then we'll talk further about some of the specifics of some of the work you're doing today.
Yeah, thank you, Carson, and thank you guys for having us. Yeah, so the Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies is a 501c3 nonprofit focused on accelerating research into democratizing access to non-ordinary experiential states that are particularly beneficial for promoting updating of one's beliefs and forming more adaptive behaviors that promote human flourishing. So we've been focused on everything from developing personalized neurofeedback to assist individuals with reaching deep meditative depths, with using neuromodulation to the same end and promoting easier access to deep meditative states. We've been working on several projects around trying to create what we call like neuromimetic states or neural states that are maximally similar to those that are observed on psychedelics. However, trying to take a non-pharmacological approach to achieving the same state so that you can confer the same benefits without all of the social, cultural, pharmacological contraindications that prevent many people from accessing the beneficial outcomes of such experiences. And to that end, actually, one of the things that we've been very interested lately, and something that my collaborator Felix is going to be happy to talk to everybody about today, is the phenomenon of aesthetic chills, or the feeling of getting full body goosebumps and chills when engaged with specific aesthetic material. And we think that this represents a highly accessible and operationalized phenomenon that is quite similar to the psychedelic state when looked at it through the right lens and can promote similar beneficial outcomes. So we're excited to share some of our research in that domain with you guys today. And yeah, if you guys want to check us out online, it's Institute for Advanced Consciousness Studies, you can learn a bit more about the other projects at the lab as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Nico. And it looks like Shannon very kindly put your URL into the chat, which is great.
Thanks. Great.
So, well, thank you. And thank you for that overview. Felix and/or Nico, tell us all about aesthetic chills. I'm really curious, not only, of course, from the neuroscience of it, what they are, what you think is happening. If you want to talk about maybe some of the other fun work you were doing with ChatGPT, for instance, that was kind of intriguing to hear. It's a pretty cool story. But I'm also curious too, just from a personal level, just very briefly, how did you get turned on to this kind of research? What motivated you to go down this path? So I'm curious to know that, just like I said, just very briefly.
Yeah, hi. Thanks, Carson. So chills is the sensation associated to shivers, which are short skeletal muscle tremors associated to the dissipation of heat for the maintenance of body temperature constant at 37 degrees Celsius in human. And in humans, the same sort of physiological event is also associated not with temperature regulation, but information regulation or information processing. And so, typically people experience chills in response to music or, moving speeches or films, specific film scenes trigger the chills. But mathematicians and physicists also report that they experience chills when they manage to solve some difficult problems that they may have been working on for some time, or when they understand, some work that has the potential of synthesizing large bodies of problems. And people also experience chills in social rituals. So specifically in the football stadium, I know, there was the Super Bowl this weekend. I'm sure a lot of people had chills then. And in sort of religious rituals also all over the world. So there's all these events that seem to trigger this, physiological response that is, really amazing from a scientific point of view because, first of all, it's fully conscious. A lot of emotional processes actually, start within the brain before we can become aware of them. And chills are a little bit different in that through the physiological event, the information processing is rising to consciousness. So it's a kind of a binary yes or no response. Did you get chills or not? And we can really have some precise measurements, in principle, at least in terms of maybe the most physical quantity there is, which is heat. And it's also the brain correlates of chills have been relatively well studied, even though there's not more than 10 studies on the topic. But we have a pretty clear idea of what seems to be happening at that level. So that's exciting too. In terms of what got me interested in chills, I remember the first time I had chills as a kid. I was 12 years old and I was watching Dog Day Afternoon in England, where my parents used to send me off for the summer to learn English. And there's this scene where Al Pacino gets out of the bank and starts screaming, "Attica, Attica." And I had no idea what Attica was, but, the crowd just started cheering with him. And I felt, this like goosebump feeling or chills. And at the time, I just, started buying cigarettes because I was off in England on my own. And I thought, oh, this must be why people tell you not to smoke cigarettes. And, then you have weird things like this that happen where your body starts, behaving in unpredictable ways. But yeah, long story short, later on, I after high school, I trained to be a filmmaker, and I actually went back to school to study neuroscience to understand how we could invent new film techniques to tell stories in a radically different ways. And chills seems to be a very good use case for understanding how movies can affect us, generate emotions, and so on. So that's how I got to chills. Yeah.
That's fascinating. Really interesting. So you wanted to be a filmmaker, so therefore you decided to be a neuroscientist in order to be a better filmmaker. And now you're a neuroscientist studying chills.
Well, I see myself more as a technologist and engineer. I'm not, I think research is amazing and very interesting, but I'm most interested in the application. And so in the context of chills, we've been looking at depression specifically, and we have some pretty exciting results using chills and chill stimuli and, new versions of chill stimuli to mitigate or deactivate maladaptive beliefs in depression and improve things like reward sensitivity.
Very cool. So this is what some of the work I happened to be down at the lab, just recently and got to, engage in some conversations, which is always interesting, just hanging out there, listening to you guys just talk. But tell us a little bit too then about the maladaptive schema and the notion of the depression resolution, or I'm not sure if that's the right language, but tell us about that.
Yeah, so in order to study chills, we had to build a number of instruments. The first one we built with the support from our main funder, Joy Ventures, was this algorithm that can span through YouTube networks to detect comments where people mention chills, goosebumps, shivers, or any sort of words related to this physiological, like what neuroscientists call somatic markers. And so we built this database of 300 stimuli, and mostly again musical pieces, mostly religious music, speeches like motivational speech, and films, specific film scenes that usually depict scenes of altruism or self-sacrifice and generosity at large and kindness. And so we had these stimuli, and we started examining them, looking at them from different angles and testing them against different populations to try and see which are the most potent stimuli. And so there's kind of like two routes to how chills are connected to these schema, but I'll take the short one because we're kind of numerous on this call, so I don't want to take too much time. But it turned out that there's this like connection between the chill stimuli and their semantic content, and these instruments that cognitive and behavioral therapists use that's called early maladaptive schema. So early maladaptive schemas are maladaptive cognitions that are developed in infancy in adaptation to dysfunctional childhood, or dysfunctional like household and childhood environments. So they're adaptive in the first period of life, and then when the child develops autonomy from the household, they start being maladaptive. That's why you have so many problems with teenagers, for example. And so it's a set of 20, 30 beliefs that relate to the self, others, and the world in general. And there seems to be like this direct connection between these chill stimuli and some of these schema. So again, that's like the short road. I could take like a longer road to explain why that makes a lot of sense in terms of computational neuroscience and so on. But for the sake of brevity, I'll take it. So what we've been interested in doing is showing some of these videos specifically targeting schema that are associated to depression. In that context, that would be the schema of shame or defectiveness, beliefs such as if people saw the real me, then they wouldn't love me, or, I'm not worthy of love, or things like this. And after exposing 100 subjects to, one of these motivational speech that's trying to target specifically the schema and generates chills, we found that chills, can sort of deactivate these maladaptive schema. And they do so in a manner that seems to resemble the mechanism of action, with the associated to the psychedelic experience. So, of course, that's a whole field in itself that's also sort of young and growing. But we've been interested in using some of the questionnaires that researchers use to probe the phenomenology of the psychedelic states. Specifically, we've looked at things like what's called emotional breakthrough. That's a construct invented by our colleague, Leo Rosman, who's now at the University of Exeter, or things like psychological insight. That's another scale that people use to measure the psychedelic experience afterhand. And this is important insofar as these scales usually predict for the long-term outcome of the psychedelic experience. So right now we have no way of knowing how long this effect of deactivating schema with the chill stimuli lasts. But, since these scales are usually associated to long-term beneficial outcomes, that's, one indication not only about the mechanism of action during the chills phenomenon that could lead to this deactivation of schema, but also their potential effect on the long term. as kind of like, one of these important experiences that shape your perception of life in general.
Wow.
Yeah, it
Very
was a
cool.
bit long, but yeah.
No, it's fabulous. No, don't worry about it. We have a lot of space, a lot of time to talk about these things. Nico, do you have anything to add there? Or it looks like you might. No?
Yeah, Felix does a fantastic job. I mean, this is his area, but I would add that, I think for a lot of those reasons that Felix is talking about, it's I kind of recognize chills as one of the most underappreciated and understudied phenomenons in neuroscience because of how revealing it can be, right? Especially when you start looking at individual differences, right? Like, why am I getting this peak emotional full body response that's leveraging, processes that are responsible for my very homeostatic persistence, right? It's a very intimate probe, right? Why is something giving me chills and not to you? And what does that say about the world model with which I navigate the world, right? Why is something moving to me and not you? And what does it mean about how my behavior has changed as a function of that experience? So, I'll just add a little extra texture that, Felix and I have kind of been playing around the idea that chills are in a way similar to the ways in which exercise is both a probe and promoter of fitness. Chills can be this probe and promoter of well-being as well, right? And some of the work that we've done, which Felix can talk about, is actually showing the degree to which chills is like a biomarker of sorts in certain populations, and then can also be this amazing ameliorative experience of certain symptoms in clinical populations. So I think it's very exciting and honestly understudied, except by Felix, who's been prolific in this space and done a lot of the work on researching it. Yeah.
Yeah,
And
wonder if I could just jump in real quick and go back to some of the things you shared earlier, Felix. It's so easy for us because the chills typically manifest in a physical way in the body. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the at least the way I think about what it means to be human. We're body, but we're also mind, not brain, but mind, and we're also spirit. And I'm wondering how you see the chills in that context.
Yeah, I think one of the most interesting thing about chills is that they're surprising. So there's something that happened to you and it's surprising. And sometimes the sort of things that trigger chills can even be a little bit unsettling. Like, I don't know if you look at the X Factor, for example, and some woman shows up and start, singing beautifully. It's so expected, and you're a little bit ashamed even of having like this response to this. So that's one thing that's really interesting to me. It's that chills are surprising. And the fact that chills are surprising speaks to the fact that a large portion of our mental processes occur below the threshold of consciousness. And that, chills are just this amazing opportunity to study how unconscious mental processes rise to consciousness, and therefore get a really precise sense of the, dynamics at play and the correlates and so on. So, this is how I would look at it. Of course, it's hard to, not take into account the fact that a lot of the stimuli that trigger chills are religious in nature. Even if you look at the musical pieces that trigger chills, they're religious pieces. And if you look at the scenes, the movie scenes that trigger chills, they also speak to, in many aspects, the core of what it means to be humans. Even though you always want to be careful with overgeneralization and keep in mind that these stimuli are well defined culturally and so on, and it could be that the sort of things that give chills to the Maasai will be very different from the things that give chills to Californians. But at any rate, there's something about it that seems to be speaking to the core of what it means to be human. And, so chimpanzees also have chills. We can also try and go down that evolutionary road. And I've had a few discussions with primatologists on the, chills. So in other primates, chills occur in the context of bluff display that has to do with territorial defense. So it's the typical like King Kong thing that, people think about when they think about, primates. And So it has to do with conflict resolution within the group, and I mean of a certain territory. So, I think that's kind of interesting. Anyway, I don't know if that answers your question, but here's some elements.
Thanks. Just briefly too, because I'd like to get to the medical doctors, Sam and Chris, but I'm curious, Nico, I saw that you posted something in the chat around witnessing acts of altruism, and that somehow seems to have an impact. Can you speak to that? And is that something that's commonly called moral elevation, or is moral elevation something different?
Yeah, I was responding basically to a question there. But yeah, it's interesting. Felix can add nuance to this, but in one of our best performing videos, it is actually this observation of someone doing selfless, altruistic acts, and the narrator is saying like, "Oh, what is he getting out of this?" And people in the video are kind of mocking him in some sort and making fun of him, like, "Oh, like, why are you wasting your money helping these, giving donations, etc." And then the kind of chills event is this time period where he realizes the downstream impact of his charitable giving, and really gets this kind of unexpected closure to, like, "Oh yes, this is my payment, this is my reward," is the ability to see the impacts and share in this collective joy. And it does seem as though in some of our research, right, observing altruistic acts does seem to, in answering the question, does seem to promote a like a cardiac neural coherence, and shared mutual information between the two time series of signals. And then furthermore, I think it actually does inspire altruistic acts as well. Felix, we were having a conversation about that recently. Could you add some texture there?
Yeah, so we conducted a study on more than 3,000 Southern Californians, showing them different chills videos, and repeatedly something that showed up is, moral elevation after the experience was increased in people who experienced chills versus those who did not. There's also, a study by Japanese researchers, Fukui and Toyoshima, that showed that musical chills can induce altruism, as measured by this game that economists use called the dictator game, which we're actually replicating here with some neural measures. So absolutely, yeah, there's this thing about chills and altruism or empathy that's where it's profoundly connected. I could add a few things about this, but I want to keep it short.
I appreciate that. Thank you. Amazing. Could go on and on about this, but at the end of the day, I mean, as a non-scientist, of course, but just as an observer, it's interesting to see how the body might be creating these signals for our own resonance, right? In the sense of like these markers, or I'm not sure of my language here, but these kind of signposts in that sense. And that actually kind of threads me to the work that Sam and Chris are doing at Seity. And I'd like to spend some time talking to them now about their work. In terms of creating a more, in my words, not theirs, but in my words, a more harmonious self-resonance in terms of the work that Seity is providing. So, Sam, I'll throw it over to you. Can you tell us just again about, or rather a bit about, your background and what you and Chris are doing and what Seity is doing?
Yeah, thanks, Carson. Appreciate it so much, and thanks everyone for having us. This is awesome. Felix, Nico, you guys are doing awesome stuff, which is really, we're excited to learn from you all too. We're going to zoom out to a different lab, a lab that was we call it our laboratory because it was our clinical practice. And I'll give you a little background just real quickly on our clinical practice, because I think it sets up how we got to where we are, and understanding the backstory was really is probably the easiest way to understand how we got to where we are doing this as clinical practitioners. So I'm a family doctor and also a fellowship trained sports medicine doctor, as is my partner, Chris Hawley. And so we were practicing in Northern California, and our practice, because of just our background and training, was attractive to a certain group of people. And those groups of people were very active people with not a lot of chronic illnesses, but a lot of life challenges. And so we had a disproportionate amount of people that would come into our clinic the right out of the gate, from right when we were done with all of our training, that had more of life challenges than the typical medical challenges that we are so trained to address. So I think the fastest way to understand that, Chris, is you should tell the story of your training at University of Washington, and I think that'll accelerate the understanding conversation.
Yeah, thanks, Sam. I agree. It's wonderful to be here. I'm learning as much, I hope, as all the audience members too. So I'm like, oh, this is really interesting. I have lots of questions. But a little bit about us. So 25 years ago, when I was 1 year old, no, I wasn't 1 year old. I was finishing 12 years of medical training, and one of the things that they did is they take you out of the ivory tower of the academic medical center and they put you in a rural community where you don't have all the specialists and tests and things at your fingertips. And it's you one-on-one with another human. And as I was finishing up the training, they let me run the urgent care that night. And a gal came in. She was in her early 20s, looked like she had everything going for her that you could think of in the world. But she had a surgical wound that was opening up. She had surgery, abdominal laparoscopy, a week ago. She couldn't get a hold of her surgeon. She's very anxious about this and in some pain. And I'm thinking to myself, I have great behavioral health training. I got this. I can talk her anxiety down, make her feel comfortable, help her with her wound, get a hold of her surgeon, make sure she has follow-up and pain medicines to get through the weekend. And I just think I've arrived. I'm a great physician. The next morning, unfortunately, there's a lot of that in my story of not being the great physician. I get a call from the coroner's office, and he said, "Hey, did you treat so and so last night?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, I just thought you should know, just for your own experience, that she took her own life last night. She took the pain medicines that you gave her, but not just the medicines that you gave her, but she went around to 4 other doctors' offices and did the same thing. And she had a plan, and she was successful with her plan." So you go through all of this training to help people. And at the end of this, I was asking some real existential and practical and operational questions of like, have I been trained properly in what it means to be human and take care of a whole human being? I think there's a ton of holes in medical training and how we practice that I haven't been trained to fill in the gaps. And fortunately, very early on in my career, I ran into the guy in one of your other boxes, Sam Romeo, who had a very similar experience with another patient that took their life right after his office visit. And we had all sorts of questions, and we said, we've got to figure out how to take care of the whole person. And let's go into practice together, and let's do some side projects to see if we can make some progress on this.
Yeah, we literally felt like when we came together, we literally felt like we were body experts taking care of humans. And humans are so much more than the body that we are trained to work on and to modify the physiology of using whatever tools that we had. So we realized like this is not a new model. We need a whole person approach to this thing. And we just started looking at the literature, and it was fascinating how ignorant we were coming out of traditional Western medical training. Go back to the 1947, the World Health Organization said, we need a whole person model of care. In the United States, 1977, the biopsychosocial model was introduced. So decade after decade, there was all these people calling for things. There's something interesting us as sports doctors experienced. 2019, after 3 years of studies, the International Olympic Committee, so there was 27 experts from 13 countries looking at almost 15,000 research articles from all over the medical literature, said, if we're going to address the needs of elite athletes, we need a whole person model. They came out with almost a 40-page position statement, and the first 2 pages called out whole person health, and the next 38 pages talked about all the medications and things that and psychological methodologies for counseling that we had been trained in. And we said, yeah, there's been a lot of talk about whole person health for a really long time, and no one had operationalized it. So we became obsessed early on in our careers of, we need to figure out a way to operationalize this. And so we just literally started doing that. We said, well, there's this world, body, mind, spirit. So that's kind of what the whole person is. And there's tons of literature out there. So let's just start, it's like branches on a tree. Let's start hanging ornaments on the, wherever we can find the literature. Let's put it in here. And then let's change our visits with our patients. And let's take the 15-minute productivity model visit in the United States and turn that into something longer. We changed actually our patient visits into hour-long visits. So we invested in relationships and dealt with all the things that we felt like we were missing in our typical specific training. And guess what happened? The rhetorical question. Carson, guess what happened? After spending an hour with people in all of this stuff, what happened? We didn't move the needle. And so we were sitting there after several years of evolving our own delivery system. We were sitting there saying, it's not more time. It's not just talking about whole person health as a way of just facilitating the different aspects. We had conversations just internally and said, well, what was working on some people and what was not working on others? What were we missing? Because we can't just add more time. And then we had our aha moment. And the aha moment was just through discussions, literally between patients at lunch and after hours. The aha moment was, we didn't have an information problem. We had an inspiration problem. And we are missing the inspiration centers of all of our patients that weren't making meaningful changes in their life. And so that sent us on a new path, which was, how do we discover the inspiration center of humans? And that works in a global way across cultures and with various backgrounds.
Yeah, so some of our patients would leave after this whole person experience and mapping and tests that we would do to map what's going on in their world, body, mind, spirit. And they'd be super inspired and ready to take on the world. And then 2 hours later, when real life hit, all that inspiration flies out the window. I'm sure we've all had that experience. If we've ever made a New Year's resolution, it's a very similar process. So what we had to do, but some of our patients were doing phenomenally and they're inspired and they made great changes. And so what we did is said, okay, how do we map that inspiration center? So we started looking at some of our heroes like Martin Luther King Jr. and Mother Teresa and Michael Jordan and Steve Jobs and all these people who overcame really difficult circumstances and did extraordinary things with their lives over a long period of time. They kept at it. So we started mapping the factors of all these interesting people in history. Had quite the diversity of values or quite the diversity of factors that were represented, and compiled them, gave big lists to our patients, had them sort through them with these big long lists, and people would go, oh, okay, that's overwhelming. I can't even track with all that. Back to the lab. We developed a sorting algorithm that made it much easier for people to sort through these things and quickly get the 4 factors that most inspired them. So my 4 are vision, inspiration, spirituality, and creativity. And when I even think of those things, it still gives me chills. And I've been doing this work for a long, long time. To tie back to the awesome chill research that you're doing. Oh my gosh, I love that, by the way. But we could talk about the neuroscience of it too, but I won't. I'll stay on track. So what we did, though, is when people started finding their own 4 factors that inspired and resonated with them, they started making crazy changes in their lives. Like, I'm leaving my job. I'm moving to New Mexico. This is what I meant to do in life. Now that I know who I am, I'm going to do something really different because if I know what inspires me, I should just go live that way. Why don't I do this? And so people started making crazy, risky moves, and we're like, oh no, I think we are the very definition of woo. We're giving them words. People are making crazy changes in their lives. What are we doing? So we started working with some academic, academic researchers in psychology, and said, help us. We're doing something, it's working, but we don't really know what we're doing. And they're like, oh, it's very obvious what you're doing. You're mapping people's core values, and there's some other esoteric tools out there, not esoteric, but just not so accessible. They're designed for the research lab, but not for clinical practice or for everyday utilization. I think we should do some validation studies. That should take about 6 months. We said, yeah, let's do it. 5 years later, after lots and lots of trials and just finding out that we were missing value centers of different cultures from around the world, like, oh, of course we didn't think of East Asian cultures. How did, that was a blind spot for us. We had lots of blind spots that needed to be filled in before this could be validated against tools that were also validated in 80 plus countries. And so by the end of it, though, we published it, our researchers published this work in the Journal of Personality Assessment, and we could confidently say in 5 to 7 minutes that we can help people find why they love what they love, why that movie may give them chills because it activates their value centers, and they could go live their life that way with a very reliable, scientifically valid experience.
Wow, amazing. What a story. So let's go a little bit further into that. Unless, Tom, of course, you have anything you'd like to ask or jump into, just, hop on in. But what I'm curious to know is, now that, this values assessment has been in place, and what are you seeing now that, scientifically validated, it's real. I've taken it, it's awesome. So what happens next for your patients? And why do you think, why do you think the results that you're seeing are in place? Just expand on that.
Yeah, it's a great question. And one of the things along our journey that we discovered is the context to well-being. And so it was fascinating for us with all of our training that we didn't know that if you improve well-being, you improve everything. Just think about that. Like, think about all the performance metrics. We work with schools. You improve graduation rates. You reduce suspensions. You reduce bullying. You improve math scores. You improve belonging. If you work with companies, you improve productivity, not for the sake of productivity, because people have their why. When you work with couples, you improve the dynamic. So when you say improve well-being, improve everything, we said we needed a context for this. Like, wow, the precursor to all of our patients' success in life, not just health, is well-being. How are we measuring that? And we said, the field is really, really ill-defined. That was our experience. So there wasn't good consensus on what we meant by well-being. There wasn't a good instrument that actually was formative, that was real-time, that wasn't reflective, that you could use in an actionable way on a daily basis. So the next path on our journey was we needed a way to measure well-being in a scientifically valid way. And here's why. Because we said well-being is the precursor to improve performance, of improving everything. But the path to well-being is really simple. And it's 3 steps. And the psychological literature is very, very clear on this. And again, we were totally blind to it until we actually started dot connecting. And that is the path to well-being for every human on Earth is to discover who they are and know who they are at their core values, to build a strong sense of self, of that self-affirmation, this daily thing where we reinforce our own positive identity, because we're all unique and we're all good. And once you have that power plant activated, then the rest of life is now live it out in everything you do. And suddenly we have a context. So if you know who you are and you love who you are and you live it out in everything you do, what psychologists would call value concordance, then a very predictable things happen. Well-being goes up, ding, ding, ding. Psychological distress goes down and performance goes up in everything. And so the way that core values connects to well-being is that whole cycle that is learn who you are, love who you are, live it out in everything you do. And of course, that's on an individual basis, but now let's just apply it to your groups, apply it to your families, apply it to those close tie relationships. Let's apply it to a society and a world. Let's know who each other are in a very authentic way. Let's love who each other are in a very authentic way. And let's encourage each other to live their best life with value concordance too. And guess what happens to the group's well-being? That goes up too. So that's the individual cycle and the group cycle.
Yeah, it's brilliant. I mean, this is one of the reasons why I love your guys' work so much. You know, I think, and again, Tom, open invitation to jump in. I think the comment, and we've talked about this together, Sam and Chris, is that notion of how does one turn to face oneself? What is that moment by which people choose to no longer, attach to the pain that they carry, that they know and that they're familiar with? And at what point are they able to choose with intention something different? How do they choose something? And this is the thing, this is a very hard nut to crack in the sense of trying to provide this in some way. Because when one thinks typically about, a spiritual path, for instance, or reads literature or inspirational books that, of course, give you chills, the question becomes there's usually a great difficulty, there's usually some sort of call, or there's some sort of challenge that's faced, and oftentimes people may or may not rise to it. I'll speak from my own example. Experience. There's been times when I've done that, and there's been times when I haven't. And for whatever reason, I'm human like all of us. But what I think is really interesting is about the work that Seity's doing is that there's this. It's like this. It's like a stealth move. It's like an Aikido move. I can't quite articulate it, but it's like, go through this simple little survey, and then we'll see what happens, and
find your Disney princess. Yeah.
Exactly. Something along those lines where all of a sudden then you're on the other side of the survey and you're like, oh my gosh, these things make sense. This resonates with me. And I kind of understand that. So again, it's kind of an open-ended question, but
yeah.
It's because the answer is simple, right? Relatively speaking, taking all pain and suffering aside for a moment, but just the willingness to move from that pain and suffering on an individual basis into something greater and more peaceful, and kind of what's involved in it. It feels to me like Seity is a great tool for doing that. So anyway, Tom, any thoughts on that? Any other thoughts that you might?
Yeah, it reminds me very much of Dr. Lisa Miller's work at Columbia University, where she's done a lot of research on our spiritual core. She's written a couple of books about it. She's been working with school children, the U.S. Army, the military, and companies where she's had profound impact on bringing down anxiety, depression, academic performance goes up, abstinence goes up. Suicide rates in the Army's gone down 28%, where she's, through her work, just helping individuals find what she calls their spiritual core. And from that, all of these other things result. And it's very similar to what I'm hearing you two talking about.
Yes, I resonate with that work. We're just still talking about humans. So of course, the same mechanisms apply as we understand ourselves as humans even better. I'll give you a short example. So we originally did this in the exam room, and then we're like, oh no, we thought we were solving a healthcare problem. I think everyone needs this. And schools started asking for this, businesses started asking for this. We've worked with Pfizer and done leadership trainings all over the world with this. Though I think some of even our favorite work is with the schools. I'll give you a quick example of how this plays out. I think what we want to demystify is the find your why, or find yourself, or who am I? Do I have to wander through the desert for 5 years? What we tell people is we're going to give this to you in 5 minutes. And once you know these words and you know that they are yours and they know that they resonate with them, finding your why is not that interesting. Now, what are you going to do with it? I'll give you an example. We heard this great story from one of the schools we worked with. There was a 6th grader who had gotten suspended for selling drugs to his friends. And the teacher's like, how am I going to break through to this kid? I can't figure out how to get him on the right path, et cetera, et cetera. Like, he actually likes selling drugs to the kids, he's good at it. And so he said, well, take your core values. And his number one core value is service. And so you think about this kid living out his value of service, how much positive feedback is he getting in his spirit, mind and body, maybe not so much in the world, but in what he's doing. Well, how can you take that service and do something different with that? And so he suddenly got this bright idea and got inspired. He's like, great. He's struggled with homelessness or being unhoused, and lived in shelters and knew what that was like. And so he gathered his friends and said, we're going to make Christmas presents for people in shelters. And I'm going to get a bunch of people to do this, and it's going to be awesome. And talk about just quickly getting a child who's lived a life of a lot of pain, in and out of shelters, selling drugs, et cetera, and going to what's right with him at the very center of his core, giving him the words that are scientifically valid, that do resonate with him, and say, now go live that out in a healthy way. This is your path. I think we're trying to get at some of these mechanisms of what it means to be human, to go in all this crazy complexity that we all know is real. How can we get to the simplicity beyond that complexity? And have a path that we can all live out that's universal, works for every human on the planet.
Yeah, and tying this back directly, Carson, to what you were saying as well. With our methodology, there's 37.9 million combinations. So it takes 5 to 7 minutes to discover your core values. So when you have a group of people, and when we were initially doing things like personality tests, because we had to discover, how are we going to help people discover this? We did personality tests, we did strength finders, we did Enneagram, lots of,
which are all great.
Lots of, yeah, they're super
Disney
cool.
Princess.
They're
Belle,
good tools. But when you're sitting in a room of people, in the room of 10 people are 2 or 3s and 7s on the Enneagram, and then you look at their core values on the wall and none of them have the same core values, you say, oh, the whys are different. So it becomes, the conversation accelerates very, very quickly with simple, accessible words that are all unique to each individual. So when you have conversations, you say, you're unique and you're good. That's the starting point. And this is how. And so you have this point, now affirm it. We're going to do this through daily affirmations. You're going to do it over and over and over to keep that self strong, because there's plenty of people chipping away at us. And so we keep that strong. And now everything, like Chris said, is just live it out. Live it out. Be value concordant in a healthy way. Let me go to something that Jim, that you had talked about earlier. Some of the biggest atrocities in humankind have happened with value concordant activities in very unhealthy ways. We don't know, we never did the study, but we can predict that Hitler was living a value concordant life in a really, really unhealthy way for humanity, but it supercharged him to do it. And so if we can give people their values, their inspiration centers, the wind in their sails, and get them pointed towards healthy outcomes for themselves, for their communities and the world, then that's where this whole thing goes.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to bring Felix and Nico back in. I think there's some crossover here in terms of threading some of this together. So I also have some additional comments, but I'd like to, Nico, I think you had some thoughts about this.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, yeah. First of all, Sam and Chris, is amazing to learn about what you guys are doing. I have a lot of background and passion around the notion of precision medicine and neuroscience, and it speaks very deeply to me. And what you guys are doing is it seems very reminiscent of or what you've circled around finding is reminiscent of the quote that I love from Hippocrates, where he says that it's more important to understand the person that a disease has than to understand the disease a person has, right? And I think that you guys have kind of really resonated with that, with this core value approach. And the second thing that Felix and I have been focused on is kind of flipping the script a bit on, approaching mental health in general, right? Where there seems to be more of a focus right now on a mitigation of negative affect, right? Whereas it could be a promotion of positive affect, right? Which is kind of what you guys are saying, like, let's find not what's wrong with you, but what's good with you and promote that, right?
Mm-hmm.
and it's reminiscent, it reminds me of our work on chills, in that it should be coming out any day now. We'll share it, but some work that we've done around building machine learning protocols to leverage trait-based questionnaires and state and mood and affect to then predict out of a whole host of different chills eliciting stimuli which one is the best for you at that time, right? Because different, as Felix was talking about earlier, people with different core values, which may or may not be arising from their maladaptive schemas, or responses to other traumas, etc. If you find content that specifically addresses and reframes and speaks to the ways in which your core values, it's more likely, right, that you'll have this type of chills experience, because it's like a maximal conformance to your world model. But specifically, it's oftentimes very elucidating of that world model, which is something that our own phenomenology, right, and our own representation of the world is usually quite obfuscated to us, right? It's not terribly clear. But when we have these types of peak affect, emotional response, especially when it's full body, right? Like a lot of neuroscience, as you guys probably know, is kind of almost elitist about that which is above the neck, right? And yet it can be so revealing, right, about what is above the neck when we feel it below the neck, right? So it's this almost this orienting principle to like, oh, whoa, this must be important to me and speak deeply to my core values. And then that actually serves as this orientation to better understand yourself and actually promote well-being with that sense of pleasure that comes along with it as well. I don't know if Felix had anything additional to say that, but I'm just a really big fan of what you guys are doing, and a lot of the same principles are slipped into our work as well.
Yeah, super interesting and very resonant with a lot of discussions we had. Again, like two things. Just to add to what Nico was saying, yes. So we built this machine learning model to predict, given some personality traits and demographics and state questionnaires as well, which video from our database is most likely to give you the chills. And one thing that's interesting is to think about doing the reverse. Like if we show you 5 videos, building models to predict what's your profile most likely to be. So, if I were to create a company that would be a direct competitor to yours, what I would do is I would, instead of doing it in 7 minutes, I would do it in 3 seconds or 3 minutes by showing you the chill stimulus and then seeing how you react to then predict the core values. So I think what's really interesting, again, goes back to this, notion and what's really interesting about the work you're doing is, this notion that chills are surprising, and that, it speaks to the fact that sort of the highest levels of organization in the central nervous system are not accessible to conscious cognition. And through instruments like yours or through stimuli like ours, you can become aware of it and learn to discover what matters most to you. And this to me is very valuable and interesting, how these sorts of psychometric or psychiatric instruments can be used for self-discovery, or to use a term that's kind of out of fashion, but I think really beautiful term is introspection, the internal spectacle, right? And yeah, this is something to me that's really interesting, how first of all, the observation that the highest level of organization in the cognitive system are unconscious and vague, and people don't know. And second, the realization that we can build tools and technologies and products to help people get a better awareness, and that would trickle down throughout the whole system, as you were, pointing out. I mean, it's no surprise that you see all these improvements in all sorts of different areas of life and activities, since these are sort of the structuring categories that are at the very top of your cognitive system. So if these change, the whole system changes, which is typically what you see in the case of a religious conversion, for example, or psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. And some, one thing we've been thinking about on this context with Nico is we want to be able to write down a really good theoretical paper that would allow us to make sense of this expression, this film changed my life. What exactly does this mean? And I think it speaks to the same sort of mechanism of this biochemical cascade that starts with consciousness and the realization of the self. So yeah, super interesting.
Yeah.
Very eloquent. I'd just like to add and just kind of offer something. It's fascinating to me, and this is, I think, Felix, what you were just speaking to really at some level is this core of flourishing, in the sense that it's this notion, in my mind at least, and again, I'm not a scientist, but just as I'm observing and listening, it's the notion of reflection of self. It's this notion that there's this externalization of who and what I might be or think of myself as, or maybe I don't know, but it's that returning. It's kind of that sovereign gaze back unto oneself that really originates from oneself, that seems to, I don't know, kind of points to a lot of the main spiritual teachings and practices that I've come into context with. But it's this notion again of how do I see myself, and how do I then, and in that process of so doing, there's an affirmation, right? And there's this reframing and this sense of like an ease or something else that as a result of that, of one's own reflection onto oneself by whatever means that might be. Anyway, random thought, wanted to throw that out there, but that's what it feels to me like. That's flourishing, right? It's that notion of then being able to say, I recognize myself, I see myself. Now with intention, I will make choice to live a life that, however you want to define that's more beautiful, it's more harmonious, whatever it might be. Maybe there's less suffering for you in front of that. Anyway, thoughts, Tom, any thoughts to add?
Yeah, what I'm hearing in this conversation, and I've read that not just our physical body, but our energetic body, our spiritual body, collectively, who we think of who we are, is hit with something like 44 billion pieces of information per second, and about 4,000 of that 44 billion make it to the human brain. Much of it gets processed by the amygdala, and a very small subset gets to the prefrontal cortex that interprets, decides, determines what we call reality. And yet a lot of that information gets stuck in the body. And so Peter Levine's work from the 70s and 80s somatically gets stuck there until we can process that trauma through. And what I'm hearing the four of you speaking to is, how do we change those filters of what of those 44 billion pieces of information per second actually make it to the prefrontal cortex and affects our worldview and how we're operating. And I love that the four of you and the research you're doing is helping inform and shape not only the science, but for the individuals that you're working with. It's extraordinary work.
It really is.
Thanks. One thing that I think maybe I could summarize to connect our two worlds, which are really the same world, is when we talk about the whole person, we talk about it in terms of concentric circles. And we like to do that to create a dinner plate where we can all understand all of our unique work and perspectives, but put it in something that's generalizable that we can all approach. So if you look at the outer layer as our world that we all share, where everything happens that's outside of our body is going on in our world. And then we've got our body, obviously, which we know what that is. We have a mind, which has our thoughts, feelings, emotions, subconscious, etc. We have our spirit that can be inspired or crushed, depending on the moment. And then we have the core of who we are, our value centers, where what our work does is helps give words and an entry point into, it just doesn't explain the whole mystery of what's inside you. We'll be doing that for the rest of our lives and then some. But it does give you access to that value center. And then to connect that, when you live out your values, it inspires your spirit. Your spirit's like, yeah, I love this, which informs your mind, your thoughts and feelings and emotions. It activates, from a neuroscience perspective, the reward center of our brain, gives us clues to why our brain's going to light up. So I'll go back to my values: vision, innovation, spirituality, creativity. And you see Baby Yoda in the background. So when Han Solo says, it's all true, I guarantee you measure my chill factor, I'm like, because what's happening from a whole person functional approach is it's resonating with my vision, innovation, spirituality, creativity. It's lighting up my spirit. The dopamine or the reward centers of my brain are going nuts. My body, which has a peripheral nervous system in addition to a central nervous system, is activating those muscles that you mentioned earlier around my pores and things like that. And I'm getting the chills and the heat is dissipating to that. But most importantly, what's happening to the world around me? What kind of energy am I giving off? What kind of electromagnetic waves am I getting off that are creating resonance with other people, even though they don't like Star Wars? They're still getting good vibes from that. We can measure those waves too. It's all measurable. But when we have that whole person approach, all of our work really, really matters. And we can see how it all fits together. And we can keep doing it with more intention and more passion and more purpose for what we're all trying to do. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. So I think we're kind of heading towards the end of our time here. I don't, Nico, Felix, Sam, do you guys have any last other additional final comments? If not, no worries.
Yeah, I wanted to say two things. So first, regarding what you were saying about self-perception, I think that's tremendously important. And I think it speaks to maybe why depression and anxiety and other mental health disorders are so prevalent, that a lot of this self-perception, we get it from our social environments and how people respond to what we do, right? How the values are embodied into specific, actions and the consequences of these actions, and then the sensory feedback we get from these consequences. So, I think we live in a more and more, in the West at least, a sort of individualized, self-centered way where through technology and centralized systems and institutions, we no longer need and depend on each other. And therefore, there's fewer and fewer opportunities to get this feedback from others of, thank you for what you've done for me or for the community and so on. And, that may speak to this, lack of flourishing that leads to the current state of mental health. So I think, there's something there. On the model that you were just presenting, Chris, I've been reading a lot recently on this theory in positive affect literature in psychology and neuroscience called the broaden and build theory. I don't know if you've ever heard of it, by Barbara Fredrickson. So there's some really interesting work on the relationship between emotions and their valence, whether they're positive or negative, and consciousness and time perception or chronoception. And there's this model where negative emotions carry on some survival value because they constrain our attention and consciousness to specific preset problems and deploy the right behavioral programs, usually innate, to respond to a threat or a loss. And so, you have these fight or flight, automatic sort of responses that really constrain your perception of time and your attention to a specific part of your environment. In opposition, you have positive emotions that don't have survival values by themselves, but open up your perception and your attention and your consciousness so that then you become able to develop new skills that you can deploy into the world to solve new problems. And there's an abundant literature on how these positive emotions serve this purpose of broadening and building consciousness and skills around the notion that makes you more creative, for example. It improves your attention even at the level of eye saccades and oculometry. It improves your openness to social criticism, which is really interesting again to this back to the question of self-perception, right? And a range of other factors. And there's a beautiful article by Eric Garland called The Upward Spiral of Positive Emotions, which I think does a really, really good job at presenting this whole framework. So yeah, I was thinking about this.
Cool. Nico, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, many thoughts, but yeah, I would just add that, while a lot of this is, very interesting in these research settings that we're doing, we've actually been deploying some of this into clinical populations, and this extends into, ecologically valid, meaningful updates in clinical populations behavior, right? Like, for instance, like individuals with anhedonia, right? The type, a subtype of depression where people are actually, struggling with the capacity to feel pleasure. And that goes on to impact, very basic human decision-making processes like, value-directed decision-making, right? Like it just seems natural to people that are not suffering from this to make decisions that beget more value for less effort, right, et cetera. And, in any type of economy, that just makes inherent sense. And, people with anhedonia show an inability to to do that behavior. But if we find them the right chills at the right time and actually give them chills, compared to other people who watched the same video with anhedonia but didn't get chills, these patients begin to start acting in these probabilistic reward tasks like normal controls, right? Very fascinating. And, we've been digging deeper into this, and, it seems as though we can really get to people's core values and their early maladaptive schemas and permit for them to have a reframing that moves them very deeply. Like, you should really see some of the
Awesome.
feedback that we get on these studies. And, I just kind of wanted to add that, while we're coming from it from this, philosophical and like theoretical neuroscience perspective, I think it has very meaningful clinical value with the promotion of positive affect, and taking a precision-based response. So yeah, anyway, really happy that we were kind of able to have this confluence of discussion from these different areas. Awesome. Props to the
Cool.
organizers.
Sam, any thoughts?
No, I mean, Nico, I love what you're saying, and I love how this conversation was able to zoom in and out, both with basic science and applied sciences and basic science, and it's because it's relevant and that's life. And so I feel like I would just be saying another way of what you just said, Nico, but I really appreciate the discussion and how we were able to go science in both, in a basic science and in an applied science way. So it's great. It's great summary, both of you. And I love what you said too, Felix. We've said that many times. Our identity. Just let me take one piece of it. Our identity construct, which was historically in humankind, was built by our place in the tribes that we exist. We have this new developmental reality in a global world, and we have to build an individual identity that's independent of our tribe and social identity. And so that's a new developmental task for us that's come online with this global world that we're living in, and with ubiquitous information. So I love the work you're doing. It's a privilege for us to be part of this conversation. It's great. Can't wait for the next one.
I might be smelling maybe some sort of collab at some point, but I don't know. I'm not a scientist, but it seems like should be something here that could be shared in terms of approach, but I'll leave that to the more brilliant minds. Tom, do you have anything else to add, or should we?
Yeah, I'm sensitive to the time and want to invite Jim back into the conversation and wrap up the day, but this has been extraordinary. I love the work that the four of you are doing.
Yeah, I do too. Thank you for all of you for being here.
Thank you.
Yes, I sense a collab too, Carson. The foursome was very scintillating, and I suggest we do it again. If you guys are up for it, let's have take two.
Yeah, sure.
On science and flourishing. We don't have time, but I just wanted to note two things. One, Deanna Rice put in the chat at the beginning of the conversation this notion of play as integral to flourishing, and I wanted to just bring that in because, as you all know, the capacity to be playful is an essential ingredient to the kind of lightness of being and creativity that I think is implied by flourishing. So maybe when we reassemble, we can talk about that. And then I wanted to also, given my introduction today, take up, the point that you made, Sam. I think it was you earlier about the coherence of the dark side. That flourishing is generic, if you think about it, because people on both sides of politics, ideology, religion, the light and dark dimensions all have a sense of flourishing when their emotions and their core beliefs and values become aligned with right livelihood as they're experiencing it. And, and I feel this, my sisters are all Trump supporters, right? And they're evangelical Christians in terms of their core beliefs. And so for me, I experienced Trump on the dark side. They experienced Trump in almost messianic images and proportions. And the sense of flourishing is well worth take two, I think, for this group to come back together, because I think there could be a very interesting conversation about the light and dark dimensions of flourishing, because we tend to think of flourishing only on one side. And because of that, we don't fully understand the ecstatic enthusiasm that we witness on what we consider to be the dark side. And so, Carson, Tom, I think I just will pose the questions. We're essentially out of time, but I think it's well worth a reassembling of this group to go deeper, because this is a very, very rich domain. And I want to thank all four of you and the two conveners for such a layered and nuanced conversation. It's been very important. So thank you. Before we jump off, Carson, do you want to tell us about tomorrow?
Sure. Tomorrow we're pivoting and we're looking at what I'm calling pro-social teaming. These are my words, not necessarily those of the guests that'll be joining, but we'll be with Lori Hanau of the Global Roundtable Leadership, and also a friend Noor from Schacht, who's from the YES organization, and the YES organization puts on what they call jams. And essentially both are looking at how people come together as groups and bring humanity forward first in group dynamics, and how to co-create and ultimately execute and manifest things in the world, but to do so from a human perspective first. And it's really brilliant work. So that's for tomorrow.
Fantastic. Incredible week. Thank you so much, Carson, Tom. And gentlemen, thank you. That'll bring us to a close for today. You'll all see the link to the after chat in the chat box for those of you who can join. And then we'll see you all tomorrow for our fourth program on modern flourishing. Thank you, everyone. See you tomorrow. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.